This is it. The NFL playoff picture comes down to one final week, and we are tied for a record 20 teams that are technically still alive heading into week 18. Needless to say, there's a lot of different clinching scenarios out there, and there's just so many important games being played all in this same week. So today we're going to go through what every single team needs to do to clinch their hopes and dreams in terms of playoff order, and to even punch their ticket to the big dance to begin with. First things first, let's break down the current standings and what the order's looking like in both the AFC and the NFC. Starting with the AFC, 9 teams are technically still alive, and the things that are absolutely confirmed as of right now are the following. For one, the Baltimore Ravens will have the number 1 seed in the AFC and will have a first round bye. Along with the Ravens, the Kansas City Chiefs have also locked up their division in the AFC West and are currently locked into the number 3 seed no matter what, regardless of if they win or lose in week 18. A bit further down the line, the Cleveland Browns are currently locked into the number 5 seed as the top wildcard team. Nobody will be able to surpass them, and they can't surpass the Ravens either in terms of the divisional lead, so this is where they're going to stay, and they'll play whoever ends up as the 4 seed, likely an AFC South team. And the last thing that we know is that the Miami Dolphins, no matter what, are going to be in the playoffs. There's a possibility they'll be a wildcard team, or they'll end up the number 2 seed. It'll greatly depend on the outcome of their last game in week 18. More on that in a little bit. As for the rest of the order, if the playoffs were to start today, the Buffalo Bills would occupy the 6th seed at 10-6, and the Indianapolis Colts would get the final playoff spot at 9-7, with the Texans and the Steelers on the outside looking in. As for the NFC, things are maybe a bit less clear, especially towards the top. So one thing we know for certain is that the San Francisco 49ers, just like Baltimore, will be occupying the number 1 seed and will have a first round bye headed into the playoffs. Aside from that, the only other confirmation we have in terms of the order is that the winner of the NFC South will be locked into the 4 seed. In terms of other teams that have locked up a playoff spot, the Dallas Cowboys clinched their playoff spot a couple of weeks ago, and regardless of what happens in week 18, they will be there, and the same can be said for the Philadelphia Eagles. Along with that, the Detroit Lions locked up the NFC North, so they're safe, and the LA Rams are locked into a wild card spot, although it will vary where they could finish, be it either the 6 or 7 spot. If the playoffs were to start today in the NFC, it would be San Francisco, Dallas, Detroit, Tampa, Philly, the Rams, and the Packers at the final spot, with the Seahawks, Saints, Vikings, and Falcons still having an outside shot. With that now in mind, let's take a look at all of the clinching scenarios for the teams competing in battle. Let's start with the AFC. More specifically, the AFC East, which is still up for grabs despite Miami having firm control for most of the season. It's true that they have a playoff berth locked up, but if they want to win their division and get early home field advantage with the number 2 seed, they have to either win or tie against the Buffalo Bills in week 18. Otherwise, Miami will be locked into the 6th seed as a wild card team. Simple enough, right? They're in the playoffs, but if they want to have home games, this one is super important. But things get a lot more complicated on the side of the Buffalo Bills, who are still fighting for their playoff lives. In the simplest form, all they have to do is beat Miami and they're automatically in since they win the division. But if they were to lose to Miami, then things get a bit more difficult for them and they could still technically miss the playoffs. If a win or tie is not in the cards in week 18, their fate comes down to some of the other games during the week. They could still clinch a playoff berth with a loss if one of the following things happens. Either a Pittsburgh loss or tie against the Ravens, a Jaguars loss or tie against the Titans, or a tie between the Texans and the Colts. If just one of those 3 things can happen, they can still sneak in. And it's still in the cards for Buffalo to miss out entirely as well. The following conditions have to be met though. 1, the Jags and the Steelers need to win, but also the Colts and the Texans game needs to not end in a tie. If all 3 of those things happen and Buffalo loses to Miami, they're not making it. And what's scary is, if they lose, the outcome here is actually pretty realistic, as it's not likely the Texans and Colts are going to tie. The Steelers are playing a Ravens team that are going to rest all of their starters, and the Jaguars are playing the Titans. Losing is simply not an option in this scenario, and the good news for Buffalo is the last time they played Miami, it wasn't even close, and the Bills in general have been playing a lot better over the last month, but anything can happen, especially when you're on the road as well. This is going to be a super tough game. The Dolphins usually give them hell, and Buffalo fans, you're going to be sweating all weekend long. Now let's move on down to the 4 seed, which will be the winner of the AFC South. So right now it's actually a 3-team race. All 3 of these guys are 9-7. Jags, Colts, and Texans all have an equal opportunity to make this happen. As of right now, the Jaguars are in the driver's seat. They've got the tiebreaker over both Houston and Indy right now because of head-to-head win percentage, so all they have to do is win their game against Tennessee, and the AFC South is theirs. Alternatively, and a lot less likely, they could tie and then have the Texans-Colts game also end in a tie to clinch the AFC South. However, the Jaguars still have a chance to get a playoff berth even without winning their division. They could clinch a wildcard spot with a tie, plus a Pittsburgh loss or tie in their Baltimore game, or alternatively, if Pittsburgh loses, Denver loses or ties, and then the Houston-Indy game does not end in a tie. It's kind of scary to think that the Jaguars are in a situation where they may not end up making the playoffs at all. They had a really good record just a couple of months ago, but a rough stretch of play has all but diminished their comfortable lead, and now they're fighting for their lives in a must-win game against the Titans. Now, luckily, it is against a Tennessee team that has nothing to play for and have mostly played like crap this season, but you already know how scary these divisional games can be and how badly these loser teams love to play spoiler. The AFC South is very much up for grabs. Let's take a look at what the Colts and the Jags have to do if they want to secure the division or just make the playoffs in general. So for Indy, they can clinch the AFC South with a win plus a Jacksonville loss or tie. Alternatively, they could tie their game with Houston and then still get in if Jacksonville loses. Luckily for the Colts though, like I said earlier in the video, as of right now they currently occupy the 7 seed, so bare minimum, if the Jaguars win, they can still make the wild card if they win against Houston. If not, they could still end up making it with a tie, and then either a Pittsburgh loss or tie in their matchup with the Ravens. Now, it's a lot easier said than done. This Texans team is very scary. They're super hungry. CJ Stroud is a dangerous quarterback, but all they have to do is just play well enough in this 1 week, and the playoffs are all theirs for the taking. Although, speaking of the Texans, their path is basically an exact mirror of the Colts. Win in a Jacksonville loss or tie, they get the division. Win in general, and they clinch a playoff berth as a wildcard team. Or, with a Houston tie plus a Jacksonville loss and a Pittsburgh loss or tie, they get in. That Saturday night matchup between Indy and the Texans is going to be a banger. There's so much pressure, they're rivals, it's been forever since they've played. I'm really looking forward to that one. And it seems that the winner of that game is going to punch their ticket to the playoffs, regardless of what this division's looking like. And then we're left with the Pittsburgh Steelers at 9-7, somehow always finding a way to finish above 500 under Mike Tomlin. So the Steelers are going to need a bit more help than the rest of the teams if they want to punch their ticket to the big dance. So for starters, a must in this scenario is to beat the Baltimore Ravens. That seems like the easy part considering they're likely to rest off their starters. Where things get a bit more difficult is hoping that other teams lose in certain directions. A Pittsburgh win plus one of the following scenarios will get them into the playoffs. 1, a Buffalo loss. 2, a Jacksonville loss or tie. 3, a Houston-Indy tie. Then they could have one of the following scenarios happen without them winning their game. Scenario number 4 is a Pittsburgh tie, a Jacksonville loss, and then a Houston-Indy game that has a winner. Or, with a Jacksonville loss, a Denver win, and a Houston-Indy match that does not end in a tie. If I'm a Pittsburgh fan, I'm watching that Buffalo-Miami game closely. That's going to be your best bet. That seems like the most realistic outcome for the Dolphins to take care of business at home and beat Buffalo. Honestly, even though the road ahead looks kind of scary, it's genuinely very doable for the Steelers, mostly again because they're likely going to win their matchup. At this point, they're just hoping that someone else ends up choking and does them a bit of a favor. But that just just about does it for the AFC playoff scenarios. That's what every team needs to do to get the job done. So let's hop over to the NFC now. Let's start with the simplest part of this equation, the race for the NFC East. As of right now, the Cowboys and the Eagles both have an 11-5 record. But thanks to Philly's loss against the Cardinals last week, the Cowboys now hold the tiebreaker. So all Dallas have to do to clinch the NFC East is beat the Commanders or have the Eagles lose to the Giants. Both outcomes seem somewhat realistic based off of what we've seen in recent weeks. Or, if they were to tie and Philly also tied somehow, that could also get the job done. On the side of Philly, it's a bit tougher for them to win the division, as they not only need to beat the Giants, but they also need Dallas to lose or tie against Washington. The team that doesn't win the division will be locked up as the 5 seed, and they'll have a matchup on the road against the winner of the NFC South. Where things maybe get a bit more tougher is with the race for the 2 seed. As of right now, Dallas, Detroit, and Philly all still have a shot at it. Right now, Dallas are in the driver's seat. All they need to do is win their game against Washington and the 2 seed is theirs. Or alternatively, if they somehow did lose to the Commanders, they could still get in with losses by both Philly and Detroit, or if they were to tie and then the Eagles and Lions lose and tie as well. As for the Eagles, they can get the 2 seed if they were to win the NFC East over Dallas, or alternatively, if the Cowboys lose and then Detroit lose or tie against the Vikings. The team that seems to be in the worst position to get the 2 seed is the Detroit Lions. If they want it, then they're not only going to need to win their game this weekend, but also hope for ties or losses by both the Cowboys and the Eagles, who both technically have the tiebreaker over them. A 1 seed difference doesn't really seem like that huge of a deal on paper, but just knowing how good some of these teams are at home compared to on the road, it really could make a world of a difference. Now for the moment you've all been waiting for. The race for the NFC South, the division that nobody seemingly wants to win. As of right now, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers hold a tiebreaker over the Saints as the current leaders of the NFC South, and it's looking like they actually have the best chance of any of the teams in this division to clinch it, as their final matchup of this season is against the ever so exciting Carolina Panthers. To put it simply, win against the worst team in the league, and you're in. In a result that they tied with the Panthers, they could still get in if the Saints were to lose or tie against the Falcons. But it seems simple enough. All they gotta do is beat the crummy Panthers, which shouldn't be much of a problem at all for how they've been playing recently, and they'll be golden. The thing is, though, it does get kind of dangerous for this Tampa team if they were to somehow choke to the Panthers, as their chances of making the wild card are very tiny. If Tampa wanted to somehow sneak in as the 7 seed, they would need to tie against the Panthers, have Seattle lose to the Cardinals, and then the Packers also need to lose or tie. So virtually impossible, at least in theory. Things are looking good, but they can't be screwing around, as the Saints are literally breathing down their necks with the same exact record. For the Saints, their path to the division title is also pretty simple. With a win over the Falcons and then a Bucs loss or tie, the division is theirs. Although because the Bucs are playing the Panthers, as a Saints fan, maybe you're not going to be counting on such a thing. Good news though is you could still technically end up as a wildcard team, but just like with the Bucs, it's going to be super hard for that to happen, as it's going to require a win, plus losses or ties by both the Packers and the Seahawks. Honestly, it's already worrisome enough just knowing how this division has gone and how tough the Falcons have played them in the past. The Saints are in a really rough scenario right now, and they're just praying that things can go their way. But hey, at least they have some sort of hope outside of winning the division. For the Atlanta Falcons, all their playoffs hopes and dreams solely rely on winning the NFC South, and boy is it going to be hard to do it, as not only do they have to win their game against the Saints, but they have to pray that the Buccaneers lose to Carolina. Now, they beat the Saints the last time, so maybe it's going to be doable again. But again, the idea of the Buccaneers losing to the Panthers is very far-fetched, and even just playing the Saints again is going to be tough. Those divisional matches in the NFC South always seem to bounce different ways with each week, so Atlanta Falcons are facing a big-time uphill battle. As for the wildcard teams, we talked about the 5 seed already, that's going to be Philly or Dallas confirmed, but for the 6 seed, as of right now, it is the 9-7 Rams. They clinched a playoff berth, they'll be here no matter what, but they have a chance to lock up the 6 seed with a win or a tie against the 49ers. And considering that San Francisco have clinched the first round bye, they have nothing to play for this week. So as long as the Rams play their guys, which you'd expect them to, then they're in really good shape to get that 6th seed. And that can make a big difference, as it could mean the difference between going to play Dallas on the road and playing Detroit. And we all know how scary Dallas is at home. Alternatively, if they were somehow to lose against the Niners, they could still get the 6th seed with a Packers loss or tie. Speaking of the Packers, they have a chance to actually hop ahead of the Rams for the number 6 seed if LA were to lose and the Packers win. Simple enough, right? Don't choke against a bunch of scrub backups, and the 6th seed is all yours. And speaking of the Packers, if the playoffs were to start right now, they would have the 7th seed. They currently win the tiebreaker over Seattle based on strength of victory, and a tiebreaker over the Saints based on best win percentage in conference games. And it's thanks to those tiebreakers that the Packers have a very simple path if they want to make the playoffs. All they've got to do is beat the Bears in their divisional matchup this weekend, and they automatically make the playoffs. Like I was just saying, the outcome of the Rams game would decide if they're the 6th or 7th seed, but to put it in simple terms, just win and you're going to make it regardless. The Green Bay Packers, after all the ups and downs and starting a brand new quarterback, are in a position to control their own destiny. It's not going to be easy, as the Bears have kind of been on a roll lately, and those divisional matchups are always tough and they're going to want to play spoiler, but we saw what the Packers did to them earlier this year, and they can definitely pull this off. It's in your own hands, Green Bay. Do not mess this up. There's also a bunch of other really complicated scenarios involving ties where they could make it. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous how many there are, like a tie plus a Seattle loss or tie, and then a New Orleans loss or tie. You could have a Green Bay tie, a Seattle loss, and a Tampa Bay loss, a Green Bay tie, Seattle tie, and then Tampa loss or tie. Like, there's just so many. It's very, very complicated and technically possible, but just win. Just win this game against the Bears so you don't have to worry about such a thing. Also still in this race on the outside looking in though is the Seattle Seahawks at 8-8. If they want to clinch a playoff berth and the number 7 seed, they need to not only beat the Cardinals this weekend, but then also hope for a Packers loss or tie. Alternatively, to make things a bit more complicated, they could get in if they somehow tied, then with losses by both the Packers and the Bucks, or with a Packers loss and a Saints loss or tie. It's not an easy position to be in when you don't control your own destiny, but this scenario is pretty doable for the Seahawks. They're going to be favored against the Cardinals. If they play well, they should beat them. And the Packers, while it's going to be tough to depend on a loss from them, that game against the Bears is extremely losable. Divisional games can always be a toss-up. The Bears are really strong. And honestly, you can never trust Joe Barry's defense in the clutch. Seattle still have a shot at this. Aside from that, there's one other team we have yet to talk about that technically still has a shot at the playoffs, and that is the Minnesota Vikings. Despite losing to the Packers so badly last weekend, they could still, in theory, make the playoffs if a few things go their way. But if we're being honest with ourselves, it's looking like a near impossible task. As for starters, they've got to beat Detroit. That is condition number 1. And considering that this Lions team is much better, and they're still fighting for potentially the 2 seed in the NFC, the Vikings will get no gimmies whatsoever while dealing with these quarterback issues on top of it. But even if they somehow, some way beat the Lions, they would still need the Packers to lose, plus the Seattle Seahawks, and then either Tampa Bay or New Orleans to lose as well. Vikings fans, don't get your hopes up. And that's what all of the playoff scenarios are looking like for the 20 teams that are somehow still alive right now. Let me know what you think down in the comments below on who's going to make it, who has a favorable road, and what you're hoping ends up happening. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe for more NFL content.